Ethan Caldwell was not the kind of man who sought attention. He lived a simple life on his sprawling 1,700-acre farmland in rural Montana, a place that had been in his family for generations. The land wasn't just property to him, it was part of his identity, a connection to his roots, and a testament to his hard work. Every sunrise saw Ethan tending to his crops or checking on his cattle, ensuring everything ran smoothly. It was peaceful, predictable, and exactly how he liked it. But one quiet afternoon, while sorting through some old documents related to an unrelated tax issue, something caught his eye, a document he didn't recognize. At first glance, it looked like routine paperwork, but as he read further, his blood ran cold. The document claimed that his beloved farmland had been sold not by him, but by the local homeowners association, HOA. Confused and alarmed, Ethan double-checked the details. The deed transfer clearly stated that the land now belonged to a corporate developer planning to build luxury homes. How could this happen? He hadn't signed anything, nor had he authorized anyone else to do so. Determined to get answers, Ethan dug deeper, poring over every line of the paperwork. What he found left him speechless: forged signatures, falsified records, and blatant fraud. Someone within the HOA had gone behind his back, illegally selling off his land without his knowledge or consent. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about losing land. It was about being betrayed by people who were supposed to uphold fairness and integrity. The HOA, which claimed to protect community interests, had instead acted with greed and recklessness. They had taken advantage of their position, thinking Ethan wouldn't notice, or, worse, wouldn't fight back. As the weight of the situation settled in, anger began to simmer inside him, but anger alone wouldn't solve anything. Ethan knew he needed help. He reached out to a trusted lawyer friend, someone known for handling complex cases involving land disputes. Together, they began piecing together what had happened. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that this was no accident. The HOA had deliberately targeted Ethan's land because of its prime location and potential value. To them, it was a business opportunity. To Ethan, it was his life's work. Despite the growing frustration, Ethan couldn't shake off one persistent thought. Why would they risk so much for this? There had to be more to the story. As he sat at his kitchen table late that night, staring at stacks of papers, he felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, disbelief, and even a flicker of curiosity. Little did he know, the answer to his question lay buried deep in his family's history, waiting to turn the tables in ways he couldn't yet imagine. For now, though, Ethan focused on the immediate challenge ahead, proving his ownership and reclaiming what was rightfully his. What started as a routine day had turned into the beginning of a battle he never expected to fight, but one he was determined to win. As Ethan Caldwell continued to dig deeper into the tangled web of deceit surrounding his stolen land, he stumbled upon something that made his heart race, a detail so significant it changed everything. Hidden among the dusty files and faded documents was proof of something extraordinary: his family's ownership of the water rights for the entire region. This wasn't just any ordinary discovery. It was a game changer. Decades earlier, Ethan's grandfather had been a forward-thinking man who understood the value of resources long before others did. Back when the land was still wild and largely undeveloped, he secured exclusive control over the aquifer beneath the property. At the time, no one paid much attention to water rights. They were seen as unimportant compared to the land itself. But now, in an era where water scarcity was becoming a growing concern, those rights were worth more than gold. What struck Ethan most was the irony of the situation. The HOA and the corporate developer had thought they were making a smart move by taking his land, unaware that they were also handing over access to their primary water source. Without realizing it, they had essentially tied their own hands. If Ethan decided to cut off their water supply, the entire community would be left scrambling, and the luxury development plans would crumble like sandcastles in a storm. The realization gave Ethan a strange sense of calm amidst the chaos. For weeks, he had felt powerless against the HOA's corruption and greed. Now, he finally held the upper hand. He spent hours poring over old maps, legal agreements, and geological surveys, confirming beyond doubt that the water rights were indeed his. It was a secret weapon he could use to reclaim not only his land, but also justice for himself and his family. But Ethan didn't rush into action. Instead, he took a step back to think carefully about his next move. He knew this was a delicate situation. Cutting off the water supply could cause panic among innocent residents who had nothing to do with the HOA's illegal actions. Yet, he also couldn't let the guilty parties get away with what they had done. After weighing his options, Ethan decided on a strategy. He would use the water rights as leverage, but only after exhausting all other avenues. He began by quietly visiting the pumping station connected to the aquifer. Standing there, staring at the massive valve that controlled the flow of water to the surrounding neighborhoods, he felt a surge of power. With a simple turn of the wheel, he could shut down the entire system. But he resisted the urge for now. Instead, he focused on gathering more evidence and building a solid case against the HOA. He wanted to make sure every step he took was calculated, leaving no room for doubt or counterattacks. In the meantime, Ethan allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The HOA had underestimated him, thinking he was just another farmer who wouldn't put up a fight. They had no idea they were dealing with someone who not only loved the land, but also understood its true value. As he walked back to his farmhouse, the sun setting behind the distant hills, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for his land anymore. He was fighting for fairness, for integrity, and for the legacy his family had worked so hard to build. Little did the HOA know, their biggest mistake wasn't stealing Ethan's land. It was underestimating the man who owned the very resource they couldn't survive without. And soon they would learn exactly how costly that mistake had been. With evidence of forgery and fraud firmly in hand, Ethan Caldwell filed a lawsuit against the HOA and the corporate developer. It was a bold move, but one he knew was necessary to reclaim his land and hold those responsible accountable for their actions. However, as the legal battle began, it quickly became clear that this wouldn't be an easy fight. The HOA wasn't about to admit defeat. They fought back with everything they had, throwing up roadblocks at every turn. The first challenge came almost immediately. The HOA claimed ignorance, insisting they had believed all the paperwork was legitimate. They accused Ethan of failing to properly maintain the land, suggesting that his supposed neglect gave them justification to step in. Their argument was weak, but it bought them time they used to delay court proceedings and drag out the case. Meanwhile, the developer wasted no time moving forward with construction on Ethan's stolen acreage. Bulldozers tore through fields where crops once grew, and trees that had stood for decades were ripped from the ground without a second thought. Seeing his land destroyed right before his eyes was gut-wrenching for Ethan. Each tree felled and each patch of soil turned over felt like a personal attack. But instead of letting anger consume him, he channeled it into action. He spent hours documenting the damage, taking photos and videos to use as evidence in court. His lawyer worked tirelessly, filing motions to halt construction until the ownership dispute could be resolved. Yet, despite their best efforts, progress was slow. The wheels of justice turned frustratingly slowly, while the developer pushed ahead with little regard for the ongoing legal battle. To make matters worse, public opinion seemed divided. Some neighbors sympathized with Ethan, knowing him as a hard-working farmer who had always been kind and respectful. Others, however, sided with the HOA, swayed by promises of new jobs and economic growth the development would bring. A few even accused Ethan of being selfish, claiming he was standing in the way of progress. These accusations stung, but Ethan refused to let them shake his resolve. He knew the truth, and he trusted that eventually others would see it too. As weeks turned into months, the stress began to take its toll. Sleepless nights became the norm for Ethan, who often found himself lying awake, replaying the events in his mind. What kept him going was the knowledge that he wasn't alone. His lawyer assured him that they had a strong case, and friends from the community rallied around him, offering support in whatever ways they could. Even strangers who heard about his plight online sent messages of encouragement, reminding him that he was fighting not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been wronged by those in power. Despite the mounting challenges, Ethan remained steadfast. He understood that patience was key. Rushing the process could lead to mistakes that might weaken his position. So, he focused on staying organized, keeping detailed records, and preparing for every possible outcome. At the same time, he couldn't ignore the growing sense of urgency. Every day, the developer worked on his land, made the situation more complicated and more painful. One evening, as Ethan sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought about how far he'd come since discovering the forged documents. Back then, He had felt powerless and betrayed. Now, though still outnumbered and outgunned, he felt a quiet confidence. He had uncovered the truth, gathered undeniable evidence, and built a solid foundation for his case. Most importantly, he had something the HOA didn't: the moral high ground. But Ethan also knew that the real test was yet to come. Winning in court would require more than just proving his ownership. It would mean exposing the HOA's corruption and holding them accountable for their actions. And if the legal system failed him, well, Ethan still had one last card to play. For now, though, he chose to focus on the battle at hand, determined to see it through to the end. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain: Ethan Caldwell wasn't backing down. Frustrated by the slow-moving legal process and seeing his land destroyed day by day, Ethan Caldwell decided it was time to take matters into his own hands. He had spent months gathering evidence, filing motions, and waiting for justice to prevail, but nothing seemed to stop the HOA or the developer from pushing forward with their plans. It was clear that they weren't going to back down anytime soon. So, Ethan turned his attention to the one thing he knew would grab their attention: the water supply. Early one morning, before the sun had fully risen, Ethan drove out to the pumping station connected to the aquifer beneath his land. The station was tucked away in a quiet corner of the property, surrounded by tall grass and rustling trees. Few people even knew it existed, fewer still understood its importance. But Ethan did. This small, unassuming building controlled the flow of water to the entire region, including the neighborhoods under the HOA's jurisdiction. And thanks to his family's long-held water rights, Ethan had the authority to decide who got access to it and when. Standing in front of the massive valve that regulated the water flow, Ethan hesitated for just a moment. He knew what he was about to do would cause chaos, but he also knew it was necessary. With a deep breath, he turned the wheel, shutting off the main line. At first, nothing seemed different. The silence of the countryside remained undisturbed. But as the hours passed, the impact became impossible to ignore. By mid-morning, residents began noticing that something was wrong. Faucets sputtered and ran dry, showers trickled to a halt, and businesses that relied on water for daily operations like laundromats, restaurants, and car washes found themselves unable to function. Panic spread quickly through the community as people scrambled to figure out what was happening. Social media lit up with complaints, and local news outlets started reporting on the mysterious water outage. The HOA board was bombarded with angry calls and emails from homeowners demanding answers. At first, they tried to downplay the situation, claiming it was likely a temporary issue with the municipal system. But when engineers confirmed there was no problem with the city's infrastructure, fingers began pointing in every direction. Accusations flew, tempers flared, and tensions reached an all-time high. What the HOA didn't realize, at least not yet, was that Ethan was behind it all. They had no idea he controlled the water supply, let alone that he had shut it off intentionally. Instead, they frantically searched for solutions, calling utility companies, consulting experts, and holding emergency meetings. Meanwhile, Ethan watched silently from the sidelines, observing the growing chaos with a mixture of satisfaction and determination. He knew this drastic measure wouldn't solve everything. It was merely a way to get their attention. If the HOA thought they could continue ignoring him while destroying his land, they were sorely mistaken. By cutting off their water, Ethan forced them to confront the reality of their actions. Every drop of water they needed flowed through his hands, and now they were learning just how dependent they were on something they had taken for granted. As days passed, the situation grew increasingly dire. Families struggled to cook meals, gardens wilted in the summer heat, and businesses lost thousands of dollars in revenue. The once idyllic neighborhood began to feel like a pressure cooker, ready to explode. Desperate for relief, residents demanded answers from the HOA, whose members were now sweating under the weight of responsibility. For Ethan, watching the fallout was both satisfying and sobering. He hadn't wanted to hurt innocent people, but he also couldn't stand by while the HOA trampled over his rights. Still, he knew this was only the beginning. Shutting off the water was a powerful move, but it wasn't enough to resolve the larger issue. To truly fix things, he needed the HOA to face the consequences of their illegal actions and make amends for the damage they had caused. As the crisis unfolded, Ethan prepared himself for the next phase of his plan. He had grabbed their attention, but now he needed to turn that attention into action. With the community in chaos and the HOA scrambling for answers, Ethan Caldwell knew it was time to reveal his hand. He had waited long enough, letting the water outage sink in and forcing the HOA to feel the full weight of their dependence on him. Now, he was ready to deliver his ultimatum, a clear set of demands that would leave no room for negotiation or delay. Ethan drafted a letter, carefully choosing each word to convey both authority and resolve. In it, he laid out exactly what he wanted: the return of every acre of his stolen land, the complete dismantling of any structures built on it, and a public apology from the HOA acknowledging their illegal actions. But there was one condition that stood out above all others. If these terms weren't met, the water supply would remain shut off permanently. He sent copies of the letter to the HOA board members, the corporate developer, and even local news outlets to ensure transparency. Within hours, whispers of the ultimatum spread through the community like wildfire. Residents who had previously dismissed Ethan as a stubborn farmer now began to see him in a different light. Here was a man who wasn't just fighting for himself, he was holding powerful people accountable for their greed and corruption. At first, the HOA tried to brush off the letter as an empty threat. They assumed Ethan wouldn't have the nerve or the legal standing to follow through. Behind closed doors, they mocked him, calling him unreasonable and reckless. Publicly, they downplayed the situation, assuring residents that the water issue would be resolved soon. But as the days dragged on and faucets remained dry, cracks began to form in their facade. The turning point came when scientists and hydrologists confirmed the severity of the water shortage. Reports showed that without access to the aquifer controlled by Ethan, the region could face a prolonged drought with devastating consequences. Businesses started closing temporarily, families began leaving town to stay with relatives elsewhere, and property values plummeted overnight. The once thriving neighborhood was teetering on the brink of collapse, and everyone knew who held the key to saving it. Desperate, the HOA finally reached out to Ethan directly. They offered settlements, partial compromises, and vague promises of making things right, but Ethan refused to budge. He made it clear that his demands were non-negotiable. Either they returned his land and admitted their wrongdoing, or they faced the reality of living without water indefinitely. There was no middle ground. The stalemate dragged on for days, with tensions reaching a boiling point. Local media coverage intensified, shining a spotlight on the scandal and putting immense pressure on the HOA to act. Board members, fearing for their reputations and careers, began turning on each other. Some argued for giving in to Ethan's demands, while others insisted on finding loopholes to avoid accountability. Their disarray only fueled public outrage, as residents realized how deeply entrenched the corruption ran. Finally, after weeks of resistance, the HOA caved. They issued a statement agreeing to return the deeds to Ethan's land, halt all construction projects, and publicly apologize for their role in the illegal sale. It was a humiliating defeat for them, but for Ethan, it was vindication. He had taken on a powerful organization backed by corporate interests, and won not through violence or aggression, but through strategy, patience, and an unshakable belief in justice. With the agreement in place, Ethan allowed himself a brief moment of triumph. He visited the pumping station once again, this time turning the valve to restore water flow. As water surged back into pipes across the region, cheers erupted from households and businesses alike. For many, it felt like a second chance, a reminder of how fragile life could be when essential resources were threatened. But Ethan didn't celebrate just yet. While the immediate crisis had been averted, he knew the fight wasn't over. The damage done to his land still needed to be repaired, and the lessons learned from this ordeal needed to be remembered. As he drove back to his farmhouse, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. This victory wasn't just about reclaiming his property. It was about proving that even the smallest voice could stand up to the biggest bully. And sometimes, the most valuable weapon wasn't power or money, it was knowledge, determination, and the courage to fight for what was right. With the HOA's agreement secured and his land officially returned, Ethan Caldwell wasted no time getting to work. The legal battle might have been won, but the scars left on his beloved farmland were deep, and healing them would take more than just signing documents. Bulldozers had torn up fertile fields, construction crews had dumped debris near pristine pastures, and the once thriving ecosystem he had nurtured for years was now a patchwork of destruction. It was heartbreaking to see, But Ethan wasn't one to dwell on setbacks. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work. The first order of business was clearing the wreckage. Ethan enlisted the help of friends, neighbors, and even some former skeptics who now admired his tenacity. Together, they hauled away scrap metal, removed half-built foundations, and cleaned up piles of discarded materials left behind by the developers. Each truckload that left the property felt like another step toward reclaiming what had been lost. Though the physical labor was exhausting, there was a sense of camaraderie in the air. People joked, shared stories, and worked side by side under the wide Montana sky, united by a shared goal, restoring Ethan's land to its former glory. Once the cleanup was complete, Ethan turned his attention to replanting. He carefully selected native grasses and crops suited to the soil, ensuring they would thrive without harming the delicate balance of the ecosystem. Rows of golden wheat began to sprout where bulldozers had once churned up dirt, and wildflowers bloomed along fence lines, attracting bees and butterflies back to the area. Slowly but surely, life returned to the land. Watching it come alive again filled Ethan with a quiet pride. He knew this wasn't just about farming, it was about healing. Next came the animals. Ethan reintroduced cattle to graze on the newly restored pastures, their lowing echoing across the hills as if welcoming old friends. Chickens pecked at the ground near the barn, and horses trotted freely through open fields, their hooves kicking up clouds of dust in the late afternoon sun. The farm was buzzing with activity once more, a stark contrast to the eerie silence that had settled over it during the height of the crisis. While the physical restoration was underway, Ethan also took steps to ensure this kind of disaster wouldn't happen again. He installed stronger security measures around the property, including cameras and fencing, to prevent unauthorized access. More importantly, he filed additional paperwork to formalize his family's water rights, making sure they were legally protected against future threats. These precautions gave him peace of mind, knowing that his legacy and his resources were safeguarded for generations to come. Word of Ethan's victory spread far beyond the local community. News outlets picked up the story, portraying him as a symbol of resilience and justice. Strangers reached out to congratulate him, sharing messages of support and admiration. Some even traveled from neighboring towns just to meet him in person, eager to shake the hand of the man who had stood up to corruption and won. For someone who had always preferred solitude, the sudden attention was overwhelming but also deeply gratifying. Ethan realized that his fight hadn't just been personal, it had inspired others to believe in the power of standing up for what's right. As the months passed, the transformation of the land mirrored Ethan's own journey. What had started as anger and frustration had evolved into something greater: hope, determination, and renewal. Standing on his porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the horizon in hues of orange and pink, Ethan felt a profound sense of closure. His land was whole again, not perfect, but alive and thriving. And so was he. But Ethan didn't stop there. He used his newfound platform to advocate for greater transparency and accountability within local governance. He attended town hall meetings, spoke at community events, and encouraged others to question authority when something didn't seem right. His message was simple yet powerful: if I can do it, so can you. By sharing his story, he hoped to empower others to fight for fairness and integrity in their own lives. For Ethan Caldwell, the ordeal had changed everything and nothing. The land was still his home, his sanctuary, and his connection to the past. But now, it was also a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the enduring power of justice. As he walked through the fields that night, listening to the rustle of leaves and the distant call of cranes overhead, Ethan knew one thing for certain: no matter what challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them with courage, with purpose, and with the unwavering belief that doing the right thing is always worth it. The dust had finally settled, and life on Ethan Caldwell's farmland was beginning to feel normal again, or as close to normal as it could be after such a tumultuous chapter. The fields were green, the animals were healthy, and the sound of tractors humming in the distance replaced the noise of bulldozers that had once invaded his peace. But for Ethan, this wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the start of something bigger. The ordeal had taught him, and everyone around him, lessons that would resonate for years to come. In the wake of the scandal, the HOA dissolved completely. Its members, disgraced and discredited, faded into obscurity, leaving behind a community hungry for change. Residents came together to form a new governing body, one built on transparency, and accountability. Elections were held, and ordinary citizens stepped up to lead, determined to prevent anything like this from happening again. For the first time in years, people felt a renewed sense of trust in their leaders, a stark contrast to the corruption they had endured under the old regime. As for the corporate developer, they quietly abandoned their plans for luxury homes in the area. News of the debacle spread quickly through industry circles, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of cutting corners and ignoring local rights. Other developers took note, wary of repeating the same mistakes. The land that had been earmarked for sprawling estates remained untouched, its natural beauty preserved thanks to Ethan's relentless fight. Ethan himself became a local legend. His story inspired not only those in his immediate community, but also people across the country who followed his journey through news reports and interviews. Farmers, homeowners, and activists alike saw him as proof that even the most daunting battles could be won with determination and strategy. He received letters from strangers thanking him for standing up to powerful forces, and many shared their own stories of injustice, seeking advice or simply expressing solidarity. But fame wasn't something Ethan sought. If anything, he used it to drive meaningful change. He began hosting workshops at his farm, inviting neighbors and visitors to learn about sustainable farming practices, water conservation, and the importance of protecting natural resources. These gatherings weren't just educational, they fostered a sense of unity among attendees, reminding them of their shared responsibility to care for the land and each other. Ethan often ended these sessions by saying, "We're all stewards of this earth. What we do today shapes the world our children inherit tomorrow." Perhaps the most profound impact of Ethan's victory was the shift in mindset it sparked within the community. People started paying closer attention to how decisions were made, questioning authority when things didn't add up, and holding leaders accountable for their actions. Conversations that once centered on convenience and profit now focused on sustainability and fairness. Even local schools incorporated Ethan's story into their curriculum, teaching students about resilience, ethics, and the power of standing up for what's right. For Ethan, the experience reinforced values he had always held dear: hard work, integrity, and respect for the land. It also deepened his appreciation for the connections he had forged along the way. Friends, neighbors, and even former critics had rallied around him during the toughest moments, proving that communities are strongest when they stand together. Though he preferred solitude, Ethan found joy in knowing he had earned the trust and admiration of those around him. On quiet evenings, as he sat on his porch watching the stars twinkle above the horizon, Ethan reflected on everything he had been through: the betrayal, the anger, the sleepless nights. It had all been worth it. His family's legacy was safe, and the land he loved so deeply was thriving once more. More importantly, he had set an example for others to follow, showing that even in the face of overwhelming odds, justice could prevail. Ethan Caldwell wasn't a hero because he sought glory or recognition. He was a hero because he refused to back down when it mattered most. And as the seasons changed, and the cycle of planting and harvesting continued, one thing remained clear: Ethan's story would live on, not just as a tale of triumph, but as a reminder that courage, perseverance, and a little bit of cleverness can move mountains.